So Python Audiographer, this is what I titled my project. However, I'm not going to start out by telling you what I did, but rather why I did it. So I play a lot of music. I love playing different kinds of music, different instruments. But the way this started was actually from an assignment I was given by my saxophone teacher. The assignment was to listen to a piece that had some improvisation in it, some soloing, and I had to transcribe the solo. I had to write it out as sheet music. And I like music, I like playing music and listening. I don't like writing it out. That's the worst part. It's very complicated, it takes time, it's tedious. And so I thought to myself, being as lazy as I was feeling at the time, is there something online that can do this for me? And so I did some Googling, and it turns out there was not. And so instead, I made this. One moment. I made this, which is a program that I call Python Audiograph. So if you'll give it a moment, it's going to compile. And I'll tell you now that the microphone is not the best, so it may have picked out external sounds, but it gives you something along the lines of, if you ignore these shorter notes, it gives you da 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 da, etc. And it finishes the sheet music, although there's a little bit of extra data going on in there. And so that was the idea that I had, right? Get something where you can play music into it, and it'll spit back the sheet music, which is much faster than playing something and then writing it, or listening to something and then writing it. So how did I get started? Or first of all, how does this work? Because there's, as all programming does, and especially in Python, which is, I guess, a language for writing programs, it's based on a flowchart kind of idea where if this happens, what happens next? Kind of thing. And how the program works, I'll keep it plain and simple, right? It listens to the sounds, it has a specific set of frequencies, which are different vibrations that are specified numerically. That's what distinguishes different notes from each other. So it figures out, it has a list of frequencies that it knows. If the note that's played is one of those frequencies, then it saves it to a list. If it's not one of those frequencies, it still saves it to the list, but it recognizes it as no sound at all, or as a rest. Once you have that list and you're done recording, we move up to here where it counts how many of the same note in a row there are for every single note. That's what's called a for loop, which is where you do the same thing for each component of a series of pieces of data. And so it sees how many of each kind of note there are in a row, and if there are several, then it tells the program to write out on the sheet music a longer symbol for a note than another shorter sequence of notes might be if there were only 2 in a row as opposed to 6 in a row or something like that. Then after that, it compiles it into a language which can be read by a certain program called Frescobaldi, which then builds the sheet music based on that list of data that you saw scrolling across the screen before, and spits out the sheet music. And so, that was a double click. In order to make this, there are a few issues I had. First of all, I needed something that could recognize notes, and I did some research. And luckily online, I found a YouTube user who goes by the name of Virtualan. And so he has this program in public domain, which I will show to you right now. Essentially what it is a tuner. It'll hear anything that's going on and spit back the notes. That's all it does. I'll keep talking and it'll keep scrolling across the screen and open up new pages and new pages. It just hears a note and tells you what it is. And it's also a tuner in that if it's green, it means your note is in tune. If it's white, then it's a little bit out of tune. If it's red, then it's very out of tune. But that's the least useful portion of this to me, but otherwise it was extremely useful because I found something that can collect data from sound. What I needed to do next, and I'll stop running this, is
So is that your voice?
that is my voice, yeah, picking it up. That was live, my voice, picking up notes. what I needed to do next was to figure out how to write it to sheet music. I did some more research and I found a language called LilyPond, which is a Python-based language that, that writes out sheet music if you format things properly. And in this program, I'll actually show you, there's a, why is it free? There should be, there's a list of frequencies. It's a numbers associated to a name, and what you see on the screen is all of these letters. So I had to change those into LilyPond language so that it would comprehend what it was being given and then write it out as sheet music. And so at this point, it got something more like this. And if we want to volunteer, Howard, do you want to play something on the keyboard? Actually, I'll restart it really fast. Wait 1 second, and when I say go, play something. Go ahead. And so you'll notice that he held out a note near the end for a very long time. Keep that in mind, because that's very important. But what you'll notice about the sheet music is that it's exclusively a series of quarter notes, so there's no variation in the time whatsoever. It's just equal length, no pauses, all of that, which means one thing. It means that the program doesn't understand that there's such a thing as silence or rests, and it doesn't mean that there's a such thing as combined notes. So every single letter that you saw on the screen gets put as its own symbol. And so first I had to figure out how to extend notes, and to do that I used a counter system that I briefly explained in the flowchart. But essentially what that does is it looks at the list of data that you give it. It says, here's a letter, or here's the name of a note. How many of the notes after that, immediately following that, are the exact same thing? And depending on how many of those notes are the exact same, it will add one to the counter, or it will add more to the counter, and eventually it'll say this is the quantity for which this note should be written out. So if there are, I think, 16 I have in here, if there are 16 of the same note in a row, that constitutes a whole note. Then between 12 and 16 is a dotted half note, etc., getting shorter until the 16th note. And so once we did that, or once I did that, then I had something a little bit more like this. Would you like to demonstrate again, or volunteer yet again? All right. Page. And so now, and I mean I think it's being a little buggy for some reason, but anyway, what you have now, you have 16th notes and 8th notes and quarter notes. For some reason it's not doing anything longer. I'll figure that out later. It was working before. But you see that now there's variation in length. However, there's still no rests, no pauses, nothing like that. And so what I had to do is I had to tell the program that there are 3 scenarios. These were that would indicate that there should be nothing, or not nothing written, but a rest written as opposed to a tone. And those three scenarios are if there's a frequency that's higher than the list I showed you before, if it's above the range. Then the second situation is if it's below the range. And the third is if it's too loud. There's what's called a sound gate. And so if the computer hears something that's too loud, then it won't write it in. And that's to eliminate white noise and sounds in the background, although this microphone isn't good and doesn't quite do that. But that's what it's supposed to do, and it's written as such, and if I had a better microphone it would actually do that. And what you saw as a result was what you saw at the very beginning, a piece of sheet music that has lengths and silences and everything that is needed in order to actually write out a piece of music. Lastly, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about looking ahead, since I would like to continue working on this program and developing it more and more. I'd like to be able to have it recognize even longer notes, and that is notated usually in music by a slur, so just a line connecting 2 notes together. I want it to be able to tell you on the sheet music if you were playing loudly or softly. I also want to be able to stop recording by the press of a button as opposed to just a filled up screen. That would be more useful, especially if you're doing different lengths of music. Even if it's too short, like what we were doing before, we have to wait it out. But if you could just press a little stop button, that would be much better and more effective. I also want to have in Python there's a way to have a program ask you some questions before it actually runs, and the questions I would have it ask would help you set up the piece of music, like what's the title, what's the tempo, how fast is it, and what key is it in, and things of that sort, which the program can ask. I just have to also include those. And then, I guess much farther ahead, if I could make it recognize multiple notes, that's much harder, but that's a goal I would like to achieve, so that you can have two notes at the same time and the computer will recognize both of them. And then lastly, if I could develop this into a mobile application, make it public, then it wouldn't be just for my use, because right now it's on this little flash drive. It requires several downloads, and it's kind of inefficient if you actually want to use it. But if it were a mobile app, then everyone could use it the way I'm going to use it, which is if I want to write something out, I don't have to play it, then remember it and write it. I can just have it written once it's played. And so it's extremely useful to me and hopefully to other musicians if I'm able to get it as far as a mobile application. And that's it. So if you have any questions.
Yes, Josh, you had a lovely decision table diagram at the beginning of the presentation. Did you find that was essential to do that diagram in order to carry out your project, or was it more a formality that you did after the fact?
I think that there are several components that made it important. The way that programming works is actually, like the way a computer thinks, I guess, is in flowchart. It's always, this is true. It takes in input, and then it asks a question, and based on whether or not the answer is yes or no, that's how the computer then chooses to proceed. So I felt like it was relevant to my program because that's exactly how it functions, as well as having the functionality of being a better way of explaining it to a group.
I just wanted to mention that I've played music and programmed computers combined, I guess, for 50 years if I added it together. And my code and everyone's code I know still has bugs while it's in progress, and so does my music, obviously. But it's great, and I like that you kind of have what we call a minimum viable product, where it does the thing it needs to do, and now you're thinking about, okay, as you work with it, what's working, what's not working.
Yeah, it's more about
So
proof of concept at this point than an actual functionality. Any other questions? Yes.
What did you find was your biggest obstacle to getting to this point?
I'd have to, or yeah, into the final product. I'd have to say figuring out the lengths question, because it took several tries of figuring things out. First, I thought maybe I'd time each note and based on a clock or something, and I tried that out, and the computer the program had no clue what I wanted it to do. So it took me a long time to come up with a counter idea in order to add on note by note by note. For it to recognize that that was actually one note that was longer. And that was absolutely the hardest part. Any other?
How does it tell between different time signatures? Because
at the moment it does not, which is one of the things that I would like to have it do. Right now each input is about 8/100ths of a second apart, and so I'd like to somehow, I guess, calculate it to the point where you can set the speed at which it takes in notes, but that's farther down the line.
How does the computer differentiate between a note that's long and a long note followed by a short note that's the same note?
Oh, okay. That has to do with rests, because if there's, again, it's with 8/100ths of a second is when it takes in input, and it only displays some of them. But if you stop, even for a brief moment, and if you're going to play along on the short note, obviously there's some articulation like this. So there's a little stop in there. It sees that as a rest, as opposed to as a continuation of the note, and therefore it will put a little break in before.
Josh, either in terms of the work itself or just in terms of yourself as a worker, what would you say was your biggest takeaway from this project?
My biggest takeaway. I think just the fact that there's so many ways in which you can, if you have interest in multiple things, that there's so many ways in which you can put them together. For example, I have an interest in music and an interest in computers and programming, and even more so, I have an interest in languages. I've studied several, and I think this was really figuring out how to translate from language to language, from programming language into sheet music. I don't have this screen up anymore, but there's sheet music on my laptop. And I think that it just showed me that if there are two things that even seem completely unrelated, there's always a way to bridge them. And I'd also just really quickly like to thank Rusty and Mr. Larquenti very, very much for helping me out with this project. He was my mentor, and I definitely wouldn't have been able to get this far without his assistance. So,
Presentation was much better than the rehearsals.
that's good. All right, Mr. Gould.
So when you were meeting some obstacles at the beginning and getting frustrated, did you ever come close to throwing in the towel and saying, this isn't worth it, or I can't do this? Or...
No, actually, I had a strong suspicion that it was possible. I took some breaks in there. There were definitely periods of 3 to 4 days in which I didn't even want to look at it, and then I'd eventually get back to it and say, okay, maybe if I try this, it'll work. And then eventually it actually happened.
Has this sparked an interest in programming in other languages?
In other programming,
Yeah.
absolutely. I think that there's definitely more to explore. Python has a very unique ability in being able to, in having a lot of different built-in ways to process sounds and music. But there are different languages that have all different kinds of applications, and I'd definitely love to look into those more in the future. And I plan on studying computer science a little bit as I move forward in my education.
That's great.
So the final additional observation based on something you said from someone who lives music and lives computer programming, it does seem like it's very different, but not only did you learn, I guess, that there could be two different things that go together. What I've learned is almost all through my career, I've wound up finding out eventually that more than half the people I worked with in the programming department were musicians, or actors, singers, but definitely musicians. And it totally makes sense to me, because to me they're both things that you need to know the rules, you need to know what's supposed to go together, what's allowed to go together, what's predicted to go together, and you have to know it so well that then you can just forget it all and just get in the zone and just make it happen.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that. Any more?
So do you see any commercial applications, and if so, have you thought about patenting your process?
In the specific product? Absolutely. I think that if I were to make this into a mobile app, I would definitely, pitch it commercially, if it does have, I guess, a more fine-tuned functionality, as opposed to what it is now, which is kind of an alpha. Anyone else? All right.
Great job.